Vladimir Putin is a complicated man, and more than ever it's extremely difficult to understand his desires and intentions, what makes him tick. With such a high profile and yet intensely isolated individual, it can be seemingly impossible to know what drives his decisions. But today we are going to attempt just that. You see, Putin's ideology and philosophy is actually quite clear-cut. In fact, he has written so many publicly available articles explaining his specific philosophical beliefs and motivations, alongside the myriad of speeches, addresses, interviews that have went publicly available. And of course, we can judge solely based on actions too. So let's get started. The three main categories that I can break Vladimir Putin's philosophy into is patriotism, orthodoxy, and Eurasianism. Patriotism and unity. These are two complementary terms in Russia. It really comes down to love for the fatherland as a means of uniting the people around their president. On this point, Putinism seems to be based in Ivan Ilyich's thought, which prioritizes concepts such as unity, authority, and freedom. His philosophy promotes, to begin with, this unity of the social body, which should be the work of the head of state, as Plato already recommended. This is quite clearly highlighted and embedded in the very party name of Putin's party, United Russia, and both with the importance of the popularity of the president throughout his entire tenure. This principle remains central to the political doctrine expressed by the Kremlin. Through patriotism, the state should unite citizens around it in the manner of a social contract binding the people to their supreme representative. So, as Ilyich himself put it, and I'll read his quote, "Russia needs a firm national patriotic dictatorship inspired by the liberal idea. Its head must be guided by the idea of the whole and not by particular personal or partisan motives. He strikes the enemy instead of wasting time. He leads the people instead of being at the pay of foreigners." This phrase illustrates many aspects of Putinism: love for the land of the fathers, authority, and the common good. Three elements inherent in Vladimir Putin's policy. In his book, Ilyich proposes a real political program that Vladimir Putin seems to concretize more than any other. To summarize, one sentence expresses his philosophy and marks Vladimir Putin as a spiritual son of the finger. "We know what is the main task of salvation and Russian national reconstruction. The ascension to the top of the best, men committed to Russia, who feel their nation, who think about their state, voluntary, creative, who offer the people not revenge and decadence, but the spirit of liberation, justice, and union between all classes. If the election of these new Russian men is a success and is achieved quickly, Russia will rise and be reborn in a few years. If this is not the case, Russia will fall into revolutionary chaos in a long period of post-revolutionary demoralization, decadence, and dependence on the outside." So if you're very keyed into Russian politics, you might recognize some points of this narrative throughout the state narrative. It's that fear of Russia being divided and sold, of it being controlled from the outside world, of a moral kind of degradation from the morally corrupt West corrupting Russian beliefs and ideals. And we'll see that a little bit more in the second main philosophical point. So our second point, orthodoxy. It's a means of affirming conservatism and an object of opposition to the West. If you know a little bit about Russia, you don't have to go too far back in history to a time when religion was essentially outlawed during the Soviet Union. It was seen as the opium of the masses, an unnecessary evil, something which didn't have a place in modern society. But now, things have changed. It's essential for the state's ideology, and orthodoxy is back in full force in Russia. And that doesn't mean the people are practicing it every Sunday or every week. They're not going to church all of the time. In fact, if you've ever visited Russia, there are very few regular practitioners. But if you ask a random sample in the street, most people will say they are Orthodox. They'll say they believe in God and they'll answer basic questions. The fall of the USSR allowed for a true religious renewal, which today places the patriarch in the place closest to political power. In Russia, conservatism is understood above all as the preservation and promotion of traditional spiritual and political values. This field of morality that is being developed and promoted by Vladimir Putin increases the distance that separates him from his European neighbours. It's essentially creating another form of isolationism, and in many ways this is quite beneficial for a dictator. I don't know if he actually believes this. I can't imagine that Vladimir Putin himself is the most morally righteous man who practices and prays to God every day. But it is a useful tool, and he has clearly recognized that. And let's look at some direct examples of this in action. During a meeting at the Valdai Club on September 19th, 2013, so this even goes further back, long before the war, long before annexation, well, about a year before the annexation of Crimea. This narrative started even 10 to 15 years ago. So during this meeting, he stated, and I quote, "Euro-Atlantic countries reject ethical principles and traditional identity, national, cultural, religious, or even sexual. They pursue a policy that puts on the same level a large family and a same-sex couple, faith in God and faith in Satan." I don't need to go much further on this because this really has been continuous the last 10 to 15 years. The state narrative is continually referring to a decaying West, especially a morally decaying West, which in some cases is extremely referred to as being decayed and corrupted by the devil. And more recently, Medvedev, the former president and vice president of Russia, referred to the war in Ukraine, the special operation, as a holy war. So a war not just against Nazis in Ukraine, as they call them, but a war against the entire moral decay of the West, and a war in essence against Satan himself. Pretty extreme. This area of the Kremlin's belief system and narrative, the fundamental philosophy which drives the promotion of conservatism, I think is very ironic out of all of them. I mean, regardless of what you think of Western countries or governments around the world, it is pretty ironic coming from a government which steals an unbelievable amount from state budget, from taxes, uses it on lavish palaces, private jets. These aren't the actions of a moral leader. Okay, bear with me. We're at our final pillar, if you will, of Putin's personal philosophy, and that is Eurasianism. Eurasianism is a political movement in which Russia does not apply to both the Europe and Asia categories, but instead to a geopolitical concept of Eurasia, which is governed by the Russian world. Ruski mir, as people say. There are many prominent Russian philosophers that claims that Slavs are a unique people, with their own cultural codes, and based on them, Vladimir Putin defends Eurasianism. These two notions correspond with the concepts of unification and reunification of the Slavic people, destined to regroup in a common economic or political space because of their cultural, religious, linguistic, and historical similarities. So Alexander Dugin, who is close to the president, you may have heard him in the news last year as his daughter was killed in a targeted bomb attack. He takes up this idea and promotes the idea of a new continent, essentially. Somewhere between Europe and Asia, a bridge, if you will. A bridge that unites these two very different worlds. Putinism thus wants to be at the head of a new space that will counterbalance Western culture, but also and above all bring together peoples destined to live in harmony. And a large part of the Russian strategy in Ukraine is exactly this. It's based on this belief. This idea that they are liberating and reuniting the Slavic people. And whether or not this is an excuse or a justification for ulterior motives, that doesn't matter. But what we do know is it is something that is being put forward. And in my opinion, it's quite a worrying philosophical idea. It is an assuming idea. It doesn't take into account the opinions and beliefs or acceptance from the other people who are being invaded or assimilated or reunited. And as we've seen from the intense resistance in Ukraine, it is essentially unachievable. Now, all of these ideas, these philosophical pillars, if you will, of Putin's ideology may be reasons and motivations for what he does. But on the other hand, it can also be simply justifications. So perhaps we can never fully understand Putin's motivations or what he actually wants. But we can understand some of the philosophical routes that he uses to get there, or at least justify the means. I hope this video in some way was informative or useful for you. If you enjoyed it, it does take a lot of time to research and write these. I would appreciate if you can subscribe and stick around for more. Thank you for watching and have a lovely day.